Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider. Today, I am so excited to have Laurel Buckner with us from BHP Ventures. Laurel, welcome.
Thanks, Nicholas. I'm so glad to be here.
So, I always like to start by asking, what was your journey into corporate venturing?
Yeah, maybe I have a different background from some of your other guests. I think that's really a power of corporate venture capitalists that we do come from many backgrounds since we work often with incredibly large companies, not unlike yourself and myself at BHP, the world's largest mining company. I actually started my career as an attorney. At this point, I've got about half my career practicing law and about half my career being an investor. So it's good to be looking back on that. I was at a big firm when I started in Seattle, where I currently live and run the global group from. I have an LLM in tax, so I have an advanced law degree in tax law. I started out my career as practicing international tax, mergers and acquisitions, and corporate law. From there, which I very much enjoyed, I saw many of my compatriots going to Microsoft at that time when I was practicing, and I have always been very interested in technology. So I went from a big law firm to a small VC backed technology company, which was really exciting. And from there, I uh, sold that company. I worked at a much larger company in Silicon Valley where I was the associate general counsel and then general counsel. We were in a very large transaction, sold the company to Dell. I did M&A for Dell for a little bit and then was recruited to start a corporate venture capital fund for a publicly traded company on the West Coast. And that's where my investing career began.
Okay. I'm going to have a few things to unpack, but can you also talk about how you got into BHP?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had the benefit, my last position, I was working for Riverstone, which is a natural resources private equity firm in New York. And as a result of that experience, I spent time actually in critical minerals, power generation, thinking about solar, other forms of energy generation, as well as batteries, new materials and batteries, and critical minerals. So that was sort of my first foray into critical minerals, looking at mined magnets, looking at alternatives. A lot of the things that are in the news today, I was thinking about back then, which was pretty exciting in terms of thinking about trends, and had the opportunity to get into conversation with a member of BHP who had told me they were looking for someone to run their corporate venture capital arm. I had had that experience previously as an investor, and then with my experience also in natural resources, we started talking more and more about that. And lo and behold, after many conversations, had the opportunity to move over and run the group.
Very nice. So I'll get to that later, but I want to understand a bit about your background and how it's helping you to run a CVC. And you talked about, of course, a background in tax and M&A, which clearly has helped you through that trajectory. But also the attorney background is very interesting because it comes with very strong discipline. The details matter. You have to check everything. You have to question and challenge everything. Can you share a bit about how that background and that experience is driving you today?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about corporate venture capital is that you get to be an investor. And I've been on the private fund side, as I described, both in a smaller fund, but also a much larger fund. And you're very focused, obviously, on the financials and financial return and how you're thinking about that investment. I think in corporate venture capital, I know in corporate venture capital, you have that, plus you have your the company that you work for, and there are a lot of requirements and needs and desires and interests on the corporate side. So I think it's really not just balancing, but understanding the drivers in both areas. And certainly with my legal background, as you say, the details matter. So making sure that I'm understanding comprehensively what our requirements and needs are at BHP, as well as the financial implications of the particular investment, and then marrying those two things. I think being a practicing lawyer for 15 years uh, definitely put me in many situations where I needed to talk to different stakeholders, and understanding what those stakeholders needed from an audience participation, if you will, in terms of the things that would resonate with them or what was important to them, and ensuring that I was communicating that effectively. So I think that in addition to the details matter, effectively communicating and understanding stakeholders' needs has been really important in corporate venture capital, because you have stakeholders that are on your cap table, other investors, the company, employees of the companies that you're investing in, but then also as we talked about at the top, the requirements of your own corporate parent and your own employer and what they need. So effective communication, understanding needs, and communicating those requirements, I think, is really important.
I think you touch on something so fundamental about corporate VCs. I think financial VCs, they have to find startups, they have limited partners, they have co-investors, but typically the stakeholder management is simplified versus corporate VC, where you really have not just one corporate as a mothership, but many, many teams inside, many different motivations and engagements. So I feel like what you've learned from your background is not just stakeholder management, but also kind of customer mindset, trying to understand each stakeholder's goals and motivations and try to reconcile it when it feels like it's impossible to.
I think that's a good way of saying it, for sure. But that makes, I think, our job so exciting because it does add that dimension. Sometimes I say I'm a frustrated engineer. I don't have an engineering background, but I love working with engineers. And that was one of the things that really attracted me to the BHP role. We have have an incredible employee base. I have incredible colleagues. And I get to talk to a lot of engineers about a lot of different things, metallurgists and mechanical engineers and process engineers, and really understand as best as I can, again, their requirements as a customer. I get to think about what are some of the things they're interested and excited about. What are some of the trends that they should be maybe thinking about that I'm seeing? And so, absolutely thinking about them as a customer. We even, I think about that even internally in voice of the customer as we think about that at BHP Ventures.
Hmm.
What's needed from our customers, and again, how do we effectively communicate with them?
No, that makes a lot of sense. Now, why did you say frustrated engineer? Why is it frustrated?
Oh, me, just because I was never schooled in engineering. And
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm not a classically trained engineer. I don't have an engineering degree. And so I'm a frustrated engineer because I don't have the
Okay.
underpinnings as having studied it in school. However, I would say that's always been an interest of mine, and
Okay.
specifically around technology. And I've really leaned in to learn as much as possible in whatever role that I'm in. And I find that the technical aspects of my job tend to be some of the most interesting. For me personally, I'm sort of the most curious about them. And again, I think that's no real benefit to being in the CVC role, because I get to spend time talking with incredibly talented engineers, and frankly, have to understand as best I can those requirements from them.
So maybe we need to rebrand that to curious non-engineer. But
Okay,
you,
curious non-engineer.
yeah. But you're right. I think we have an amazing opportunity in the CVC or VC, but to keep learning. We learn from the entrepreneurs, we learn from our corporates, from the various teams, we learn about innovation, what's coming, what's not coming. Every day is different.
Yes, for sure. I think people who are curious and people who like to be learning have I mean, they say growth mindset, but really are in a position maybe to be curious first or to ask questions first. I think probably enjoy the variety that you and I have by being in corporate venture capital.
Very nice. Now, one thing about your journey that's interesting is you decided to join a tech startup. And from Seattle, you decided not Microsoft, but a startup that was VC backed, which was then acquired and then acquired again. And you were in the M&A track as well. So can you speak to that perspective of joining a startup that becomes acquired and that probably added to your M&A track in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think joining the startup from my big law firm is probably one of the smartest things I did. When I look back, I actually had an offer at the same time from a very large publicly traded company in Seattle, a tech company in Seattle, and I chose not to take that route, which was perhaps a little bit more of the route less traveled at that time, given other folks who were also leaving my firm, to go to Microsoft, as I said. But working in a startup, and I think you and I have talked about this before, certainly on the last time that we were together in
Yep.
San Jose. I think that's an incredible experience for people who want to become investors. I
Mm.
think it's been a great experience as an investor because I remember back in the day when we would make a sales goal at the end of the month, there would be a bell. And I think this is maybe sort of folklore. I don't think that people do this anymore, but we would make a particular sale or make our sales goal for the month. And the salesperson on the 31st or 30th of the month would ring the bell and we would all be so excited about that. And there was a real sense that we were in it together. There was a real sense of community. There was very much a sense of whatever job needs to be done. I'm going to, sweep the floors or put water in the refrigerator or whatever needs to get done in order to ensure that we can ship a particular product, reach a particular sales goal, meet a particular milestone. And so there was really a sense of camaraderie of the folks that I worked with, which I very much appreciated, as well as just exposure to how companies work. I was the second lawyer at the time when I joined. And as a result, you do everything, as I said. So
Yep.
had exposure supporting sales, product, engineering, HR, finance, funding rounds, everything within the company. I got to be a part of. And as a result of that, I think I understand how startups work at a particular level just from that experience. That has really made me, I think, a better investor. Not only because I can empathize with companies like many who are going through many ups and downs, and the startup that I was at, that they were no exception to that. I think when you're building something new and exciting, that
Yep.
is definitely the case. And so I have a lot of empathy when I come to my portfolio companies from my lived experience. And I think the kinds of things that I was exposed to there, I think had I gone to a larger company, I wouldn't have had that broad exposure. One of the things that I'm really proud of that actually, in your point to M&A that I think is pretty exciting, is I was assigned running the patent program when I first got to the startup. So I met with the engineers often and with our outside patent lawyers. We filed provisional patents. We filed patents off of our provisional patents. We had a really incredible patent portfolio as a result of that. And about seeing those patents through, prosecution, that whole process was under me. And I learned so much about hardware and software patenting process as a result of doing that. Those patents that we had received and some fundamentals that the company had received initially, fundamental patents that it received very early on in its inception, ended up being acquired, as you said, through the M&A process. So through the first sale to a company in Silicon Valley, and then we sold that company to Dell. And at the end, when I was at Dell, those patents were instrumental to Dell as they were looking at including those patents in their patent portfolio. So I got to interface a bit with patent lawyers who were at Dell, and that was very gratifying and satisfying for
Yeah.
me because of the patents that we had received so long ago at the startup that were really fundamental in the space that we operated in. So that's been, I think, also an experience that I bring currently as an investor when I think about how are we protecting this IP? What is the advantage of the company in that current IP environment or market? Is it something you can protect or not protect? Are they working on that or not working on that? Who are they? Who do they have around them to help them advise what they should be patenting? How are they protecting their intellectual property? And how is the market
Mm.
developing? That's certainly a different landscape today than when it was 25 years ago. But I've seen that landscape change, and it's a pretty dynamic and exciting time for sure to be an investor.
Now, one more question about your M&A experience because it's an
Yeah.
experience where you learned how to sell the business or to be bought, as well as buying later on other companies. How does that help you inform how you advise your own portfolio companies at BHP Ventures?
Yeah, I think I definitely am always thinking about exits, like I think all investors are when you make your first investment and subsequent funding and financing. You're thinking about where's really the home for this technology? What does it look like to fit into a larger enterprise or to access public markets, perhaps through debt or through an IPO? What are the sequential offerings that need to happen before those particular companies will be able to reach those liquidity events? How is the board prepared? How is the company prepared internally to have a liquidity event? As you know, that's a really big part of selling a company is making sure everything is really buttoned up before you get to that process. Not unlike a financing, but certainly more intense and in depth. Both as an investor, I've had many of my portfolio companies be sold and acquired by large companies. And when you get to be on the acquirer, like I was at Dell, you understand the types of things that large acquirers are looking for and what that process will mean as the large company is going through that process. Dell was certainly a serial acquirer, building a
Mm.
software competency at the time that I was there, which was very exciting. And there was a lot of M&A that was going on, serial M&A. And so that is something that I think I've been able to incorporate. And as I look at my own investment portfolio about how they're maturing or ready for that type of exit. And that's always really sometimes at the top of my mind, but always in the back of my mind.
Now, top of mind, back of mind, is that something you feel like there's a right time to talk about it with a portfolio? Because if you talk about it too early, that may actually be seen as your buyers that you're buying us, but to sell us quickly. And so, how do you approach that with a portfolio? Is there a good time? Is there any best practice you would recommend our audience to think about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think developing a positive relationship with management is so important as an investor. And so I see these as conversations that are happening that are ongoing between an investor and management. And if there's ongoing conversations about all kinds of things, then also talking about exits or liquidity events or partnerships or what kind of how the market is developing is a natural evolution of those regular cadence and calls and conversations. And that really is born out of trust, the trust that you
Mm.
have with management as you come in as an investor, how management views you, the type of value add that you're providing as a capital provider, but then other things. Again, as BHP, we can hopefully bring expertise to the company. That's part of our value add in ways that other financial investors aren't. And so I think, again, these are part of the panoply of things that we discuss as I'm an investor in the company and certainly reaching liquidity event or how they're thinking about subsequent financings. The M&A conversations are simply an extension of those financing conversations.
Okay. Now, my last point about your background is you've been a general counsel, and that clearly comes with a different way, a different bias when you think about an investment. What are the best practices you're using today that comes from that experience?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I don't know that it has any other I suppose everybody has some type of bias depending on their background, right? I
Yep.
think,
Yep.
I always think about CEOs that way, wondering what their background is. If they're engineering or sales or product, you can sort of see that that influences the way that they lead. I think in my investing, certainly my legal background, as I think about the way that rounds are structured and the composition of cap table and how the parties are negotiating terms, how they're
Mm.
thinking about terms, how that's going to affect the company and subsequent financings. I think all investors think of it that way. Perhaps I am maybe a little bit more attuned to some of those things, having been a general counsel. Perhaps also in diligence, thinking about IP or thinking about the way that they're exploiting or protecting, even their trade secrets and what gives them a competitive advantage. I might maybe more sensitized to that after my experience. But I often think of myself as a general investor. So don't tend to think of myself as coming from that legal general counsel background. Again, about half of my experience now in my career has been being an investor and not actively practicing law. So hopefully I'm providing value. That's the most important thing.
I am sure you do. So then you've been invited to join BHP Ventures to run the firm. BHP Ventures was launched before you joined. And so I want to touch about this experience because I think that's going to become more and more common as we see more and more CVCs. You're going to need people who have experience joining to run a CVC that's already been ongoing. Can you share maybe how you address the first 30 days of you joining BHP Ventures, what it is you did, you looked, what were the priorities you set? Because that's going to be something our audience, many of them are going to at some point be asked to join to lead a CVC that's already ongoing, what it is they should be thinking about.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, BHP is 90,000 people globally with operations in Australia, Chile, Canada. It's just incredible in terms of joining a global operation. There are folks on the ventures team that are in Singapore, across the United States and Australia. So for me, when I first joined, really in the first 30 days, it was getting my arms around the folks that were already on the team. It's really an incredible group that I was so fortunate to join that started about 5 years. They made their first investment about 5 years before I started. So it was pretty mature function for sure. They had, incredible processes in place, the way they thought about investment. They had a great portfolio. I think that was truly the envy of many venture funds just as an investment portfolio. So I really felt like I stepped in to a car that was already traveling very fast. And so for me, it was just getting my bearings around not only the team that did an incredible job bringing me up to speed internally around the way that we did things within BHP Ventures, but also who were the people within BHP that would be important for me to meet, understand who they were. And so they created an onboarding pack for me, and I got on the airplane and had the opportunity to fly to many different places to meet people in person. And that I think was invaluable for, again, stepping into an existing fund at a very large global company.
Okay. Now, before you join, you probably had some alignment with the top management about what should be the goals. Maybe the goals were, please keep it going the same way, please make some changes. Any tips about how you align before you even join about what it is you're going to bring to the firm?
Yeah, we talked a lot about strategy. We talked a lot about, the current portfolio and the types of things that the team was doing for sure. And I, as when you're in the interview process, it's as much of diligence for yourself to better understand the opportunity that you're stepping into. So I continued through all of those conversations to be more and more intrigued, not only by the maturity of the function and the team and what they had built, but also how they BHP, I would say, really thinks about venturing in terms of being able to keep an eye on technology trends and what's coming over the horizon. So we talked a lot about that. Um, I do think the strategy itself, we were continuing and have continued. But the most important in today's world, I think, is really listening and being able to pivot into the growth areas and the trends because the technology trends are just really evolving so quickly now. And so, again, it was about effective communication internally about the trends that we're seeing and and how that would be informing the strategy with respect to individual investments that we would be making. I feel really lucky at BHP. I report into the chief development officer, which is an incredible woman named Catherine Raw. She has just great experience also being an investor, being a CFO at a mining company. And she leads the strategy function. So it's myself, business development, M&A and strategy are the functions that report into her. And so we, unlike other corporate venture capital arms that might report to the CFO or might report to the chief technology officer, I report into strategy. And so thinking about what our strategy is with respect to investments, and then how we make those decisions based on the strategy of the company overall is an important, I think, piece of where BHP Ventures fits in the overall BHP um, outlook and strategy.
So I think that's fascinating, and maybe this is where I want to double down, which is BHP from the outside is this massive, successful industrial company, but you wouldn't think technology as the first thing about BHP. And here you have a strategic function, which is all about, I think you said, pivoting into growth trends. Can you speak to how much of that strategic function augment BHP and how much of BHP Ventures is augmenting that strategy?
Oh, um, I think the strategy and how we think about executing on our current business and opportunity is really, you know, led certainly by our department, but in large partnership also with the other folks that are on the C-suite with our CDO. And so our technology function, we spend a lot of time with them thinking about where they're going. Our innovation group, which is called BHP Invent, that is taking later TRL technologies and running pilots with our
Mm.
assets. So this is really, I would say, an interdisciplinary approach. Ventures sits alongside, and our exploration function, which is based in Toronto too. So we spend a lot of time with those other groups as they're also touching and moving and listening to the organization. And then we work in concert, with getting feedback from what are the needs of the organization, and then also what are the trends that we're seeing, as well as our, strategy arm that are my colleagues. We talk a lot about what are trends that we're seeing in the future. So it's really, as I say, multidisciplinary, as opposed to ventures certainly does not work in a silo. And again, I think that's something, as I talked about, by being a startup where we all get to be sort of all for one for all. That's an experience and a work environment that I very much enjoy. And so as a result, I get to do that, at this larger company again, which is 90,000 people globally. But for us, I get to work across, other groups that are also thinking about what are trends that are happening today, where is the company going, and what are the opportunities for us.
I think your earlier answers about your background shows very nicely now, which is all about stakeholders management, understanding their motivations and where they want to go. And I even like when you said in concert with, because it really is like building an harmony together in something beautiful. Now let's talk about your portfolio. So you joined, there was already a portfolio. Of course, since you joined more investments, how do you handle the portfolio management in a way where clearly you want to be helpful to your portfolio, but you also want to help your mothership know where to go and where not to go from your learnings? What would be the best practices that you have deployed in managing your portfolio to really bring maximum value on both sides?
Yeah, well, we have about half of our team on the ventures group are working solely on investments. So they're looking all the time at filling the top of the funnel, talking to companies, better understanding the landscape globally because we're global investors. And then about half the folks in the group are focused on portfolio management, listening to the business, taking existing portfolio and driving in conjunction, sometimes with BHP Invent, maybe a pilot, or driving a knowledge share or better understanding or sharing a trend internally. And so I think that really works for us to have these two groups, and we're very close. We come together, weekly, sometimes more often than weekly, but formally we come together weekly and talk about what's happening on the invested side and the portfolio side. We have a great way of communicating digitally with each other so that we're on the same page, knowing what's happening in the portfolio function, but also knowing what the investors might be seeing or listening to as they might be attending a conference or speaking with other investors that are in our space as well. And so I think that has proved to be a very effective system where you have a leader that, in this case, the woman that runs the portfolio group is actually based in Melbourne, which is where our headquarters are. And so while we have assets around the world, it's great to have her in Melbourne, Australia, where she can also be, listening again to the priorities and then conveying them back to us. The companies that portfolio that we stepped into, as I said, was just an amazing portfolio. And how we think about portfolio management is, contact with those companies regularly, listening to how they're thinking about their next product or release, matching that again with our needs and the kinds of things that we are seeing that the business is looking at perhaps in the future. And then, of course, always thinking about what the next raise or capital need is and how we can continue to support the company as it grows.
Wow. Okay, I have a few questions, but I will just offer that our portfolio program director meets with the person in Melbourne and maybe interview her about the best practices she's deployed. But first golden nugget is half your team is investment team, half is really about portfolio management and engagement. Do you see a difference in terms of team composition and sourcing between the two? Are you looking more at external for one and more internal for the other? How are you thinking about the team, where they come from?
I mean, effectively, if you look at the types of engagements that those two teams have primarily, you could certainly classify them as the investors being external or more externally focused, excuse me, and portfolio being more internally focused. Having said that, both teams also are external and internal, if you will.
Okay.
So we've had a great opportunity. Mel Bergen is the name of the woman that runs portfolio management out of Melbourne, and she's had a great opportunity to speak at conferences and raise our, portfolio and awareness in Australia, for example, or in other markets. Jack, as well, a member of my teams in Singapore, who also has been involved in speaking at events in Asia, speaking at events in Japan and in Singapore, which is an incredibly active environment. So it's so exciting to have somebody in that region. And so those folks would be considered portfolio, but they are also external facing, gathering information as well as they continue to mature, what's required internally on the portfolio side. The investors are certainly looking for deal flow all the time, and investors get deal flow from the portfolio team from activities that they're doing in their particular regions or countries. So I think it's a really nice balance of both internal and external. I would say the investors also spend time with our invent team as well as our assets. When we look at a particular company and we're thinking about making an investment, we really want to know, is this a good strategic fit? Is this an interesting technology for the kinds of things that we do? So we definitely are internally facing, talking with folks internally about how they might be viewing a particular technology or trend. Certainly the portfolio team is involved in that as well, but the investors are involved in those internal conversations.
Very nice. And in terms of recruitment, are you looking more from people who were at BHP before, or you also recruit externally?
Yep, both. We think it's a great opportunity for folks at BHP to be able to rotate into the ventures team. So if they perhaps are not familiar with ventures or unsure of what ventures does within the mining company, to be able to have them be seconded into our group so that we can, perhaps they'll have a particular experience depending on if they were at an asset in a particular jurisdiction. So we think that that's really important to be able to have folks internally within BHP, and we've also recruited externally for people on the team as well.
Very nice. Now let's talk about investment and the best practices that comes from that. How do you decide a topic or a space you want to invest in? Does it come from your team, from BHP, from something you see? How does it all come together?
Well, we definitely have continued to invest thematically in the same way that BHP has invested before I joined. So we think about how we look at our value chain and how we can bring a particular expertise to that value chain. And that starts in our instance with exploration. So how do we find particular minerals we might be looking for? So that's a category that we're looking at. What are technologies that can help us learn more from exploration? Certainly, there are a lot of new things that are happening in that space. The second category, again, has been agreed to and defined that we're very interested in is how we think about processing of those minerals. So how do we think about perhaps getting more copper out of a particular ore body or rock, and what's the process for doing that, and how are new technologies involving that. So, uh, how can we be accretive to be able to do things better from a true mining perspective? And then we think about operational efficiency. How do we just do things better, faster, cheaper? And what does that look like? And we do them more, in a safer way. So safety is incredibly important for industrial companies. That's, very important to BHP. And then we also think about categories that give us a view as to how technologies are developing. So those are four broad categories that we invest in, that we articulate to investors, that are our main areas. And you can imagine, even within those four, there's a lot of room to look at a lot of different things, which we like, because again, things are changing so quickly. We don't want to create a filter such that we may not see something that could be applicable to mining, although perhaps the startup hadn't thought about mining previously. We want to be able to be the front door where those types of investments can come into mining, come into BHP.
I mean, we've worked with BHP Ventures, and we always find the team to be so knowledgeable, domain experts, and that makes for better investors. So maybe we can speak to that. How much do you think your superpowers as BHP Ventures, as a VC firm, comes from the fact you have BHP behind you?
Well, certainly, that is our calling card, is this incredible company that is 140 years old, that has deep expertise in mining, as the largest mining company operating the largest copper mine called Escondida outside of Chile, comes with amazing expertise. And so for us at BHP Ventures, we really get to leverage that and bring that value to our portfolio companies. And that's a very different value proposition, I think, than really any other, corporate venture capital fund that might be for, NVIDIA, for example. They have very different value proposition that their corporate venture capital team would be bringing. And I think the more that we can lean into the unique experience that we have and the unique experience that we can bring to the cap table, to other investors, to the company at large, then the more successful that we will be, because we get to carve that niche out in particular.
What I find very interesting is AI, especially since 2022 with ChatGPT. The challenge has moved from number of tokens to gigawatts. And powering AI is creating such an amazing opportunity for a company like you and the CVC you run to really identify what are the most important or critical element of the supply chain, what are the critical materials, how to source them, how to extract them, how to take the best value from them. In a way, it feels like you joined BHP Ventures at the moment of an inflection point. Can you speak to these macro trends and what that means for you and your team?
Certainly, the spotlight on critical minerals that's happened sort of the last year and a half, where that the idea of mining is brought in, I think, to the public discourse, as people are thinking about supply chains in particular. And perhaps really that goes back to COVID, when there was an opportunity to feel the dislocation in supply chains, because so much of that international commerce was shut down. That really prompted people to be thinking about source of supply in different jurisdictions. And then it was those conversations about source of supply that have evolved into going and further upstream, which I would say mining and what we do is probably the furthest upstream in many supply chains, being the supplier of the commodity itself. And so I think the conversation today is really an outgrowth from people just being more aware of global supply chains. And by focusing upstream and focusing on mining, it's given us an opportunity also to bring awareness in the marketplace about the good things that BHP is doing, how we go about the type of work that we're doing, how we see ourselves, globally as we continue to do that good work. And that's really been, I think, an incredible opportunity for us to tell our story outside of Australia. So sometimes we're referred to as the big Australian. Many people in Australia know of us, but perhaps in other jurisdictions are not aware. And so the way that this macro trend has put a light on it, I think it's really given us an opportunity to share the good work we've done for 140 years and what we aspire to do in the future.
You're right. I think when you're given the spotlight, this is your opportunity to share all the things you do well. So I want to give you a chance on this podcast. Could you share one of the most recent best initiatives that you've seen BHP driving, which I think maybe not many people know, but should know?
Well, we talk publicly for sure in our public filings and documents around our sustainability initiatives. And I think how we think about decarbonization and what our goals are. This really just feeds right into that category that I talked about, kind of better, faster, cheaper. So sustainability and decarbonization is still something that's top of mind for ventures. And it's part of that operational efficiency. You talked specifically about power and about power needs. So every business is truly thinking about how they're going to be sourcing power and generation and needs in order to do the kinds of things that we're doing. And we are no different there. So how we are thinking about the cost of energy, lower cost energy. We entered into a PPA arrangement for Escondido, which I described is the largest copper mine in the world. And as a result, much of what's being generated is renewable there. So that's been very exciting to think about, such a remote mine, to be able to bring the copper from that mine in particular using renewable resources is incredibly exciting today. So I feel really proud of those types of initiatives, which we continue to execute on globally. And I would say the Escondido one and our power purchase agreement around renewable power is one that I'm very proud of, and I know the whole company is.
And it shows true leadership. So this is really good examples.
That's true. And in today's world, it makes economic sense when you think about those types of cost of power and what it truly means to bring a gigawatt on to the grid, or even behind the meter in this instance. What is the way that we can bring our commodities to market at the right price?
Absolutely. I like to call it sustainability squared, which is you need to have the right unit economics to be sustainable, to then be able to scale sustainability like decarbonization and electrifications. So you need both. And otherwise, hmm. Now I want to shift gear to the investment decision making. Um, and here there is always this challenge or tension between acting like a VC, which needs to move fast at times, but at the same time, the link to the mothership to make sure that all the strategic value, the pre-financial value has been identified and vetted. How do you work on your investment proposal? How is your investment committee working? Do you go multiple times or one time? How does that work? And anything that you want the audience to think about when you think about these trade-offs of design?
Yeah, again, this is one of those processes that the team had set in place before I made it to BHP and the Ventures Group, that I think really works well in terms of the categories that we invest in, the groups internally that we connect with in order to validate those technologies, and how quickly we're able to operate as a result of, frankly, a really strong working relationship for many, many years. So I think, again, we talked a little bit about trust, the investor with the startup company or the investee, and the investment itself in the portfolio. And I think that absolutely goes internally as well. So the team that I joined had built this incredible portfolio. We were very proud that we were in carbon engineering early. That was an incredible exit for us. So great to have recognized and realized also returns from investments that have been made. So I think that allows, again, as a license to operate, that
Yep.
we're good stewards of capital. So folks that we connect with and that we review investments with that are on the finance side also see that discipline, again, that started many, many years before I got here. And I feel the well recipient of continuing to steward that process moving forward. So I think it's demonstrating being a good steward of capital, communicating consistently, not only about the kinds of things that you are viewing or that you're bringing along, but also really on your passes too. So you can see how big the top of the funnel is until you actually get down to making an investment. So there's a degree of trust around judgment and decision making. I think that that all helps with the investment process internally.
I think having success stories you can refer to, both from financial returns but strategic value, really helps. And I like the golden nugget of it gives you the license to operate or to continue to operate. And so you clearly had an amazing financial success as a success story. Can you speak to one, and maybe you don't have to go into the details if it's confidential, but one where you had a success story on the strategic value?
Absolutely. Um, Again, as we think a lot about waste to value and minerals processing, we've had the opportunity to have a number of investments in that particular space and how those investments have interacted with our assets, either through a formal pilot or through trialing and conversations. We have found that the decision making, specifically around uh, mine planning for future opportunities, gets informed around thinking about new ways of doing something. So I think that strategic value you can touch within the organization, maybe not only to existing operations, but also how things are going to be evolving in future operations. And we have a number of investments that fit into that category. Again, we enter into dialogue, so we're not lecturing, we're not we're discussing and partnering with an opportunity, hopefully, to drive value. And when those companies, our portfolio companies, get to interact with our business in particular, and that's a positive interaction, I think that again helps us with that license to operate in terms of driving value back to BHP.
And clearly, for your portfolio, BHP becomes its marquee customer or partner.
Absolutely. I think that's one reason why startups want to have a corporate venture capital fund on their cap table, because it's really the additional value that we can be bringing to the company. And that's really for us to demonstrate and discuss and continue to earn the trust of our portfolio companies. So, how can BHP, again, 90,000 people worldwide, how can we find the right people strategically to be interacting for the most value, both ways for the startup, but also for BHP? And then how are we helping inform or bring value that the startup might not otherwise have access to? Or maybe again, it's a metallurgical engineer who can provide some insight into a new way of making steel that's based on real world experience in the field that the startup may not be familiar with. And so really being able to drive value in whatever way. That's one example, but there are so many more.
Now, clearly, you've built a track record. Um, what's your opinion about corporate VCs leading rounds or co-leading rounds versus not?
Well, I certainly feel comfortable leading and co-leading rounds, so I think it's fine for corporates to do that. I think when they got the discipline to be able to understand pricing, be able to understand the financial um, implications of a particular structure, and they're able to structure rounds in a way that's going to be able to amass the right amount of capital with the right terms to marry those up. I think anyone that can write a term sheet with that balance and get folks on board to be able to participate should be the ones that are leading the round. Who's ever in best position to do that? That might be a corporate venture capital fund. It might be a financial VC. Sometimes you see family offices be involved. You might see a corporate VC that's spun out but has a limited partner that is solely a corporation. So they may not brand themselves as corporate VC to the market. They might look like a regular financial firm, but they do have a sole LP that is a large corporate. And I think all of those folks in the capital stack can if they can bring value and provide capital at the right time for the right price, with the right amount of people around that's driving value, then I think anybody who's capable of delivering those things should be leading around.
I really like the way you link leading around or co-leading around with the price, the valuation. And I think this is one of the things which I remember back in 2020 when I was talking to CVCs, some of them said, we're strategic, we don't care about valuation. And that was so destructive to our ecosystem because if you don't price it right, maybe the entrepreneur feels good at the time, but then it's going to be terrible afterwards for the next round of funding. And so linking that huge responsibility of leading around to having the right valuation and pricing of all the risk in is so important. So I'm really glad your answer was really linking one with the other.
Absolutely. I mean, I think especially in today's day and age, but certainly over my whole career, you have to be thinking about what the capital needs will be of the business moving forward. And that's, your capital plan. Maybe you've got a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan as you're thinking about bringing product to market, what you're expecting, your revenue is going to be from those products, what your costs are going to be, corresponding rising costs as those things are changing in today's world. Marketing and reaching those customers are certainly new channels are opening up all the time. It's a very different world today than it was, even 10 years ago. And how you're going to fund that growth, how you're going to fund that development is really an important key and those things can't be viewed in isolation without thinking about the capital component.
No, you need the
You need that, and being able to raise in the future, as you say, is often based on the round that's presented today and how that's going to impact the future. So I think investors are certainly savvy to that for sure, and making sure there's the right round today. I think maybe, I don't know, maybe what's your opinion? Do you think there's more discipline around that today than there has been in the future, or excuse me, in the past?
absolutely. I'm sure we have many CVCs who are not yet acting with the discipline needed, like a financial VC. But if I look at all the CVCs we work with, I think the financial discipline is being applied, the understanding of the power law, the discipline of looking at everything that can go wrong, the understanding of how big it could get so that you can get fund returners. Even the term fund returners was nearly never mentioned to me in 2020, and I think it's becoming quite obvious. You need to look for fund returners, which correlate with finding the winners, the market leaders that your corporates wants to engage with. No, I definitively see a strong push on this. Even I see GCV inviting top VCs to the events of CVCs, and I see the VCs wanting to engage with CVCs more and more. And I think all of that is creating this virtuous circle, showing the best CVCs and hopefully pulling the ones that didn't behave. And by the way, I don't believe for a second that people in CVCs wake up in the morning saying, I want to be a bad CVC. Some of it is constrained by what the mothership believes should be happening. Maybe they don't have the training or they don't have the exposure. And that's why this podcast, but also the GCV and even Kaufman Fellows and other organizations can be so helpful to raise the bar and the financial discipline that goes with it.
Absolutely. I think it's good, frankly, for startups in our ecosystem when we can really partner and that financial VCs can see the benefit of having a strategic on the cap table because it's a unique, again, value add that they bring based on what the corporate parent is able to provide. That provides something that financial VCs will never be able to provide in terms of learning or training or leverage, access to market intelligence. And I love seeing that partnership as opposed to perhaps in the past when there was less collaboration among those shareholders.
Yeah, you're spot on. Actually, the why of this podcast is to help entrepreneurs get better investors so they can be more successful. And the how is by sharing best practices to raise the bar of these investors. We talked about the next rounds. So, how do you think about the discipline of follow? When would you follow? When would you not? When do you go super pro rata, pro rata? How do you think about pay to play?
Yeah, I mean, I think we think about those things definitely in a similar way that financial investors think about them. So I think the way that many investors think, we follow our portfolio companies and think about when they're going to be investing, for example, in the next 12 to 18 months. I think like all investors are budgeting and thinking about that. Of course, we're a strategic investor. And so what's our strategic benefit by continuing, with this particular company? There's often a lot of changes that companies make that they might pivot or have a different emphasis, or we're seeing that today, I think, with a lot of companies have really changed the market, and they should be doing that. I think that's really the dynamism of our ecosystem, the startup ecosystem, that they're capable of changing and tacking to a market. So we look at all of those factors. We, again, are good stewards of our capital, as we discussed previously, and thinking about returns. We think about ownership. We think about exits in the future. And all of those factors go into play as we look at continuing to support our companies through their growth and growth cycles.
Maybe part of the support, especially when you lead, is to be on the board of the company. And here you can make choices between being an observer or a full board member. What is your thinking about that value add you can bring as part of being on the board, you or your team?
Absolutely. So we don't take board seats at BHP Ventures. We take board observer seats. So that is part of our governance internally. And as a result of that, as an observer, that can be a slightly different role than being a full board member, certainly, of which I've been at other times in my career. Having said that, though, I think, again, this relationship with the startup, the relationship with management, so that you're able to bring value. And that is both in the board meeting, where you're listening and discussing and observing and helping, but that's also the conversations that are happening outside of the boardroom in terms of where you can be adding value to management based on what you learn in the board meeting. And I think both roles can be important, and our defined role is observer at BHP Ventures, and we definitely bring value in that role as well.
Very nice. And maybe I need to double click, but I'm sure there is a very intentional reason for being an observer. Could you speak to that so that the audience understands the distinction and why is a deliberate choice?
Yes. So there are often legal ramifications with being a board director that have to do with fiduciary responsibility and liabilities that might come with being a director. If you are not a director, those statutory liabilities that might arise depending on the jurisdiction that you are in do not arise. You do not have the types of responsibilities that directors do when you're an observer. Those observer rights are negotiated when investors make their initial investments. So an observer right is not something that's just given to an investor. It's directly negotiated in the documents as part of the investment. And as a result of how we think about those types of risks internally, and I think many big companies do this as well, the company has decided that directorship responsibilities are very limited.
Very nice. Now, my last question is about what it is that you are looking at now, or your team is looking at, or that's very exciting for the next 12 to 18 months.
Yes. Well, I think, I'd be remiss if I didn't say AI and ML, specifically physical AI. So we made an investment at a company called Field AI. We participated now in 2 rounds with them. We're very excited about that. We were very early on, almost 2 years ago now. We made our first investment in them, and that's the AI brains for robots. So how those applications, specifically in the industrial space, are evolving is so exciting. So that's one area, physical AI, but then also just the general application of AI and ML in the industrial setting. So how can we learn quickly through those trends, and where does it make sense to deploy them? Of course, there are folks internally at BHP, that's their sole focus. It's not my sole focus, but if there are things that I can learn for how those technologies are developing and bring them back to the incredible folks internally that are responsible for those initiatives, I think that's really an exciting space for the industrial companies.
I agree on everything you said. Laurel, thank you so much for sharing best practices, your learnings, your opinions, and how you see our industry moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. I really enjoyed it.